I never meant to notice her perfume the night we met in the hall. My name is Jack, and I rent the spare room in my house to a woman named Amelia, who is younger than me by a fair number of years. For 6 months, we kept it simple, rent on the first, and a nod in the kitchen. Then she smiled at something I said in that narrow space and told me I only notice when she's standing close, and the house stopped feeling like it was just mine. I haven't figured out what to do with that yet. The house sits at the end of a gravel road about a mile outside town, 2 stories of old clapboard siding painted white so many times the trim has rounded edges where the layers built up. The front porch sags in the middle no matter how many times I jack it level, but my father built the back one himself, and it sits straight, which tells you something about who did the real work around here. I moved into this house when I was 26, after my parents passed, within a year of each other. Mom first, then Dad, like he was only holding on long enough to make sure she was taken care of. The house came with the land, and the land came with work, and the work came with a silence that filled the rooms the way heat fills a kitchen in summer. For 10 years I lived alone in that house, and it suited me fine. I work with my hands for a living, small residential jobs, drywall and framing, and the occasional deck rebuild. I leave the house at 6 most mornings and come back around 5, and the routine is as solid as the foundation. When you spend your days measuring and cutting and fitting things together, you appreciate a life that doesn't need much adjustment. The spare room is upstairs at the end of the hall, across from the bathroom. It used to be my sister's room before she moved to Portland and stopped coming back for anything but Christmas. After that, it became a storage room, then an empty room, then just the room at the end of the hall that I walked past without thinking about. The mortgage on a house this old, with land this small, isn't terrible, but it isn't nothing either, and neither is the cost of keeping the heat running through a winter that starts in October and doesn't let go until April. So when the idea of renting the room came to me, it wasn't because I was lonely. I wasn't. I needed the income, and the house had space it wasn't using, and that was the whole truth of it. I put an ad online. 1 room, shared kitchen and bath, quiet house, no pets, references required. I wrote it the way you'd write a help wanted sign for a job that nobody with better options would take. And I figured that was fine. I didn't want someone with better options. I wanted someone who needed a quiet place and paid on time and didn't fill the rooms with noise I hadn't agreed to. What I didn't know then was that a house this quiet doesn't stay quiet once someone starts living in it. And a hallway this narrow doesn't let 2 people pass without something shifting between them, whether you want it to or not. A week went by. Then 2. The ad sat there and nobody called, and I started to think maybe the house was too far out, or too old, or too quiet for anyone looking for a room. I was almost relieved. Then the phone rang on a Tuesday night while I was fixing the seal on the kitchen window, and a woman's voice said her name was Amelia. She asked about the room. She asked about the distance to town. She asked if the house was as quiet. As the ad said, I told her it was quieter. She said that sounded right. She said she'd come look at it on Thursday. I hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen with the window seal half done in my hand, and the house felt different already. Not wrong, just different, like a room you walk into and can tell someone else has been there before you, even though nothing's been moved. She showed up Thursday afternoon in a sedan with a small dent above the rear wheel and a single suitcase in the back seat, and her name was Amelia Carter, 27, from a town 2 hours east that she didn't want to talk about. She had dark hair that fell just past her shoulders, and the kind of stillness in her face that makes you think she's already measured the room before she steps into it. She walked through the house without saying much, kitchen and bathroom and the narrow hallway upstairs, before ending up in the spare room, where she stood in the middle and looked at the east-facing window and nodded once, the way you nod when something matches a picture you've been carrying in your head. I showed her the lease. She read it standing up, which told me she trusted herself to catch the fine print faster than most people do sitting down. She signed it and handed it back and asked when she could move in. I said Saturday if she wanted. She said Saturday worked. She moved in on a rainy Saturday morning with the suitcase and 2 boxes and a framed photograph she set on the dresser. Right away, I didn't ask who was in the photograph. It wasn't my business, and I'd already decided this was going to stay a simple arrangement. Rent on the first, not in the kitchen, nothing more. But the photograph faced her bed, and some nights I'd notice the light under her door and wonder who she was looking at before she fell asleep. And that wondering was already more than I'd signed up for. The first week was the loudest the house had been in years. And it wasn't even loud, just different. The sound of water running in the bathroom that wasn't mine, footsteps overhead when I was sitting in the kitchen reading the paper, the low hum of music from behind her door, something with a guitar and a voice that sounded like it was singing to itself. I kept my distance because that's what felt right. The house was big enough for two people to live in it and hardly see each other if they timed things well. And I timed things well. I cooked my dinner early and ate it in my room. She cooked later and ate in the kitchen. Our schedules ran parallel like two wires in a wall. Close, but never touching. But the house has a way of bringing people into the same space, whether they plan it or not. The kitchen is small, and the hallway is narrow, and the bathroom door sticks if you don't pull it just right. After the first month, I'd learned her habits the way you learn the sounds a house makes at night. She drank coffee in the morning with the window open. She came home late on Fridays. She read at the kitchen table with her feet pulled up on the chair and her hair twisted into a knot on top of her head. I didn't think about her when she wasn't there. That's what I told myself. The house was just less quiet with her in it, and less quiet wasn't the same as something I needed. It was just something I noticed. She thanked me once for fixing the faucet in the bathroom, and I said it was just a washer, which it was. She smiled at that, not the way people smile when they're being polite, but the way someone smiles when you've said exactly the thing they hoped you'd say. I didn't know what to do with that smile, so I nodded and went back to my room. There were small things. After that, she left a mug by the coffee maker in the morning, with enough left in it that I could tell she'd been up before me. She knocked on my door once to say the porch light was out, and when I fixed it, she'd left a small vase of wildflowers on the kitchen counter. Not in a way that asked for anything. Just in a way that said, she saw the work I did and thought it mattered. I noticed all of it. I told myself noticing was just what happens when another person moves into a space that used to be yours alone. You register the changes the way you register a new crack in the ceiling. It doesn't mean the house is different. It just means something new showed up that you weren't expecting. That was the truth I needed, and I held on to it like a man holds on to a railing. When the stairs are steeper than he remembered, the hallway upstairs is 4 feet wide. I measured it once when I was replacing the baseboard, and I remember the number because 4 feet is just enough space for two people to pass if they both turn sideways, and just narrow enough that they can't do it without brushing shoulders. It's the kind of hallway that makes you aware of how much room your body takes up. For the first few months, we managed it by timing. She heard my footsteps and waited. I heard hers and took the long way down the back stairs and through the kitchen and up again if I needed the bathroom. It worked most of the time. The house cooperated with people who wanted distance. But the house is old, and old houses don't keep their schedules the way people do. Sometimes you just need to walk down that hallway. At the same moment, someone else does, and there's no polite way around the fact that you're going to end up close. The first time it happened, I was coming from the bathroom, and she was coming from her room. We met in the middle. I pressed my back against the wall to let her pass, and she slowed down instead of speeding up. Her shoulder touched my chest as she went by, and she didn't apologize, and I didn't either. And after she was gone, I stood there with my heart, doing something it had no business doing. I told myself it was the surprise of it. You don't expect to be that close to someone in your own house, and the body reacts before the mind catches up. That's all it was. A body reacting to an unexpected thing, and nothing more. But it happened again. Not every day, not even every week, but often enough that I started to notice the pattern. She didn't speed up in the hallway. She didn't step aside quickly. She moved through that space like she was comfortable in it, like the narrowness didn't bother her the way it bothered me. One evening, I came down to the kitchen, and she was standing at the counter in bare feet and an oversized shirt that hung off one shoulder, stirring something on the stove. The kitchen is barely big enough for one person to cook and another to reach the fridge, and she didn't move when I came in. She just looked over her shoulder and said the pasta would be ready in 10 minutes if I wanted some. I said I'd already eaten, which was a lie. I went back upstairs and sat on my bed and listened to her move around the kitchen below me, and the hunger in my stomach felt like it wasn't about food at all. Another time I came out of the bathroom, and she was leaning against the doorframe of her room with a book in her hand, and she looked up at me and held my eyes for a beat longer than necessary. I didn't know what to do with my hands, so I put them in my pockets and walked past. And as I went by, I could smell whatever soap she'd used in the shower, something clean and warm that stayed in the hallway after she closed her door. I started rearranging my habits. I waited until I heard her door close before I went to the bathroom. I took my coffee out to the porch in the morning, instead of standing in the kitchen. I went to bed earlier, so our evenings wouldn't overlap. It was a careful, deliberate kind of avoidance, the kind that takes more energy than it saves. But the house is small, and the hallway is narrow, and there is no long way around that doesn't eventually bring you back to the same place. And every time we met in that hallway, she lingered, not in a way I could name or point to, just in a way that made the air feel heavier and the 4 feet feel smaller and the walk back to my room feel longer than it ever had before. I told myself that was the right thing to do. A man who rents a room to a woman doesn't get to comment on how she moves through the house they share. But there was a part of me that knew the avoiding and the rearranging and the long way around were building toward something. The way pressure builds behind a valve, you've turned too tight. That's what I told myself. And for a while, it almost worked. Looking back, I can see what I couldn't see then. The signs were there, stacked up like mail on a counter I kept walking past without picking any of it up. She started leaving her door open when she was home. Not all the way, just cracked. Enough that I could hear her music when I walked by. Enough that I could see the edge of her bed and the lamp on her nightstand if I glanced. An open door is an invitation in any house, and I knew that. I just couldn't let myself believe it was an invitation for me. She asked me to fix things that didn't need fixing, a shelf that was perfectly level, a light switch that worked fine, a window that closed just the way it was supposed to. And every time I came to look at the problem, she stood nearby and watched my hands and asked questions about how things worked, and her voice was softer than it needed to be, and her eyes stayed on me longer than the repair warranted. I fixed the shelf, I tightened the switch, I oiled the window, and each time I left her room, she said thank you in a way that made the words feel like they meant something else entirely. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table going over estimates for the week, and she came in and set a plate of pasta next to my papers. She didn't say anything. She just stood there with her hand still on the edge of the plate, waiting. I looked up at her and said thank you, and she nodded and walked out. And I picked up the plate and took it to my room and ate it alone and didn't go back to the kitchen that night. I should have asked her to sit down or stayed at that table and let the moment be what it was trying to be, but I didn't, because staying felt like stepping into a room I wasn't sure I belonged in. There was a night, maybe 3 months in, when I heard her through the wall. Not music, not a phone call. Just crying, quiet and steady, the kind that sounds like it's been going on for a while before you catch it. I stood in the hallway outside her door with my hand raised to knock. And I stood there for a long time. And then I put my hand down and went back to my room and sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling and felt like the worst kind of coward. The next morning, she was fine. She came downstairs smiling and poured coffee and asked me how I slept, and I said fine, and she said good, and neither of us mentioned the night. But I watched her more carefully after that. I watched the way her smile came and went, the way it reached her eyes sometimes and didn't other times, the way she stood a little straighter when she was pretending everything was okay. Her perfume changed around then. She'd been wearing something light and clean before, the kind of scent you barely notice. But the new one was different, warmer something with amber or vanilla or whatever the word is for a smell that doesn't leave the hallway after she's walked through it. It stayed on the air the way smoke stays after a fire's been put out, and I noticed it every single time, and I didn't say a word. A man who fixes things for a living, and I couldn't see what was right in front of me, or maybe I could. Maybe I saw it every time she left her door open, and every time she brought me a plate of food, and every time she stood too close in the hallway and didn't move aside. Maybe I saw all of it and just didn't trust it, because trusting it meant admitting something I'd spent years building walls against. The walls in this old house are thin. You can hear someone breathing in the next room if the night is quiet enough. And there were nights when I lay in bed and listened to her moving around on the other side of the wall, and the distance between us felt like the most honest thing in the house, and also the loneliest. I didn't knock on her door the night she cried. I didn't ask her to sit down when she brought me dinner. I didn't say anything about the perfume that hung in the hallway like a question I was too afraid to answer. And every missed signal piled up on the counter, unopened, waiting for a night when the hallway would get too narrow and the space between us would get too small and I wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. It was a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays are the days I get home late. After the supply run into town that eats half the afternoon. It was almost 7 by the time I pulled into the drive. And the porch light was on, and the kitchen light was on, and the house looked the way it always looked, except that tonight it looked like it was waiting for me. I came in through the back door and dropped my keys on the counter and went upstairs to change out of my work clothes. I washed my face and stood at the mirror for a minute, looking at the lines around my eyes and the gray coming into my temples, thinking about how long it had been since anyone had looked at me the way Amelia sometimes did when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I opened the bathroom door, and she was there. She was coming from the kitchen, a mug in one hand, and I was coming from the bathroom, and we met in the middle of that 4-foot hallway, with no room to step around each other. I pressed my back against the wall the way I always did, but this time she didn't pass. She stopped. The hallway light is a small fixture mounted between our doors, and it throws a warm yellow glow that doesn't reach the corners. In that light, standing still, she was close enough that I could see the small scar above her left eyebrow, and the way her hair caught the light, and the rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed, and I could smell the perfume. The new one, the warm one that had been living in this hallway for weeks. It was all around us now because she was standing right there, and it filled the space between us, the way fog fills a valley. In the morning, and before I could stop my mouth from moving, the words came out. That's a new one, smells nice. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't clever. It was a man saying the first honest thing that came into his head because the smell was everywhere, and he couldn't pretend he didn't notice it anymore. She smiled, and it wasn't the polite one, or the thank you one, or the one she gave the mail carrier. This was something slower, a smile that started in her eyes, and moved down to her mouth, and stayed there while she tilted her head just slightly, and looked at me like she'd been waiting for me to say exactly that. Then she spoke, and her voice was quiet and steady and close, enough that I felt the words more than heard them. You only notice when I'm standing this close. The hallway went silent. Not the silence of an empty house, but the silence of a space, so full of something unsaid that even the walls seemed to hold their breath. I didn't move. She didn't move. We stood there with maybe 10 inches of warm air between us, and the perfume and the light and the smallness of that hallway made the rest of the house feel like it was miles away. I should have said something. I should have stepped back. I should have done any of the careful things I'd been doing for 6 months to keep the distance between us exactly what it was. But I didn't do any of that. I just stood there with my back against the wall and my hands at my sides and my chest doing something that felt like it was trying to break open. Then she stepped aside. She walked past me toward her room, and as she passed, her shoulder brushed my chest again, only this time it wasn't an accident, and we both knew it. She paused at her door, looked back at me once, and then she went inside and closed it, and I heard the click of the latch and nothing else. I stayed in that hallway for a long time after she was gone. The perfume still in the air, her words still ringing, and I replayed them the way you replay a sound you can't believe you heard, You only notice. When I'm standing this close, she'd been standing this close for months. In the kitchen, and the hallway, and the doorway of her room. With the book in her hand. She'd been close enough to touch, and I'd been stepping around her and taking the long way, and going to bed early and lying to myself about what any of it meant. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed and put my head in my hands, because I'd finally let myself see something I'd been refusing to look at, and the seeing felt like falling through a floor I didn't know was rotten. The house was the same size it had always been. But that night, lying in bed with her perfume still on my shirt and the echo of her voice still in the hallway, it felt smaller. It felt like it was barely big enough to hold what had just happened in it, and it definitely wasn't big enough to hold whatever was coming next. The next morning I came downstairs expecting something to be different, and nothing was. She was at the kitchen table with her coffee, and her legs folded underneath her, and her hair pinned up the way she wears it when she's not going anywhere, and she looked up at me the way she always did, and she said good morning the way she always said it. But her eyes held mine a beat longer. That was the only difference, and it was enough to make the coffee taste different and the kitchen feel smaller, and my hands forget what they were supposed to be doing. I poured my coffee and took it to the porch and sat in the old chair that's been there since my father built it, and I tried to think about the supply order I needed to place and the deck job starting Monday and all the regular things that make up a regular day. But my mind kept going back to that hallway, to the way she'd stopped and the way she'd smiled and the words she'd said so quietly that I'd felt them on my skin. I couldn't unknow what she'd said. It was in the house now. It was in every hallway passing, and every time I heard her footsteps overhead, and every time the bathroom door stuck, and I had to pull it hard and think about her hands on the same knob. The knowledge was everywhere, and I couldn't walk around it the way I'd been walking around her for months. So I started avoiding the hallway at the time she used it. I listened for her door to close before I went to the bathroom. I timed my mornings so our coffee wouldn't overlap. I came home later and left earlier and spent more time on the porch and less time in the kitchen. And every avoidance was a confession I wasn't willing to make out loud. But the house wouldn't let me. Down at the bottom of the back stairs, there's a laundry room barely bigger than a closet, with a stacked washer and dryer and one bare bulb and hardly enough space for two people to breathe at the same time. One evening I went down there to move my clothes from the washer to the dryer, and she was already there, pulling a shirt from the drum and shaking it out. I stopped in the doorway. She looked up at me and didn't move. The laundry room is so small that even standing in the doorway I was close enough to see the damp spots on her shirt where the wet fabric had pressed against it. You don't have to keep leaving rooms when I walk into them. She said it plainly, without anger, without teasing. Just a woman telling a man something she'd noticed and wanted him to know she'd noticed. I didn't have an answer for her. I stood there with my hands in my pockets and my mouth half open and nothing coming out, and after a few seconds, she turned back to the dryer, and I went back up the stairs and sat on my bed and stared at the wall and felt like a man who'd been given every chance and walked out of every single one. That night, I heard her voice through the floor. She was on the phone laughing, the kind of laugh that comes easy and often, and I wondered who was on the other end. A friend? Or someone else entirely. Someone she'd stood close to the way she'd stood close to me. Someone who didn't walk out of rooms when she walked into them. The jealousy hit me like a fist to the chest. It came fast and hard and wrong because I had no right to it. She wasn't mine. She was a tenant who paid rent on the first and smiled at me in the hallway and said things that made my chest feel like it was caving in. That didn't give me a claim on her laugh or her phone calls or whoever was making her sound like that. I was a man standing in his own house, feeling like a guest, and the worst part was that I knew I'd done it to myself. Every moment she'd offered, I'd stepped back from. Every door she'd opened, I'd walked past. And now I was lying in the dark, listening to her laugh with someone else, and wondering why the house felt emptier than it had before she moved in. That was the thing I couldn't explain. Before Amelia, the silence in this house was just silence. But after Amelia, it was the absence of something specific, and that specificity was what made it unbearable. I wasn't missing company. I was missing her, and I didn't sleep that night. I lay there and listened to the house settle around me, and every creak and groan sounded like it was moving toward her room and away from mine. And I thought about getting up and walking down that hallway and knocking on her door the way I should have done the night she cried. But I didn't, and when morning came, I got up and went to work and fixed other people's houses because I couldn't fix my own. And I knew, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes, that this couldn't go on much longer. Something was going to break, and when it did, it was going to be the walls I'd built, not the house. It was a warm evening, about a week later, the kind that comes after a long day of work when the sun hangs low and the air smells like cut grass, and the porch is the only place that still feels like yours. I was sitting in my father's chair with a glass of water and my boots off and the sky turning orange over the tree line. The porch faces west, and on a clear evening, you can watch the light change from gold to pink to that deep purple that comes just before it all goes dark. I'd been sitting there for an hour, maybe more, just breathing and letting the day go. The screen door opened behind me with its familiar creak, and Amelia stepped out. She didn't ask if she could sit there. She just walked past me and took the other chair, the one my mother used to sit in when she drank her tea in the afternoon, and she pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and looked out at the yard the way I'd been doing. Neither of us said anything for a while, and the quiet between us was different from the quiet we usually shared. In the kitchen and the hallway, silence was something I used to keep distance, but out here on the porch, with the sky going dark and the crickets starting up, it felt like something we were both sitting in together. She spoke first, and it wasn't about the hallway or the perfume, but about herself, and she told me why she'd really moved here. Not the version from the lease signing about needing a quiet place and a fresh start, but the real one about a man back east who didn't know when to stop talking with his hands, the one about the night she packed a single suitcase and drove 2 hours in the dark and didn't stop shaking until she crossed the county line. She told me about the phone call I'd heard through the wall, the one that made her cry, and it turned out to be him calling from a number she'd blocked 3 times until he found a 4th. His voice was calm and careful, and full of the kind of apology that only sounds like one if you haven't heard it before. And she'd sat on her bed after and cried because she'd almost believed him, and almost was the scariest word she knew. I listened. I didn't interrupt. My hands gripped the arms of the chair because I didn't know what else to do with them, and my jaw was tight, and somewhere in my chest there was a furnace that had just been lit and was burning in a direction I couldn't control. She said, "I picked this house because you looked steady, and you are, and that's what I needed." Then she was quiet for a moment, and the crickets filled the space, and she added something else, in a voice so low I had to lean forward to catch it, and what she said was, "That's what I still need." The words sat between us on the porch, like something solid, like a board laid across a gap that had been there so long we'd both stopped noticing it. She wasn't asking me to be her landlord. She was asking me to be what I'd already been without knowing it, the thing she'd come here looking for before she even knew my name. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't want to, but because everything I wanted to say was too big and too new, and I didn't trust my voice to carry any of it without breaking. So I did the only thing I could do, which was sit there and look at the yard and listen to her breathe and let the silence between us become something other than distance. She went inside first. The screen door creaked and closed, and I heard her footsteps on the stairs and then the click of her door. And then the house was quiet again. But this time, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt full, the way a room feels full after someone has said something true, and the truth is still hanging in the air waiting for you to reach up and take it. I sat on the porch for a while longer. The sky went dark. The crickets got louder. And somewhere between the last light and the first star, I decided I was done, leaving rooms when she walked into them. I went inside where the kitchen light was off, and the hallway was dark, but her door was open just a crack, and the warm glow of her lamp came through, and the smell of her perfume was in the hallway again. And this time, I didn't walk past it. I knocked soft, the way you knock when you're not sure you're allowed to. and her voice came from inside saying it's open. I pushed the door and found her sitting on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap, and she looked up at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us spoke for a long moment. In that silence, I understood something I'd been too careful to let myself understand before, which was that the door wasn't locked because it had never been locked, and she'd been waiting for me to try the handle. I sat down in the chair by her window, and we talked until the lamp burned low. Not about the hallway or the perfume or the things we'd been avoiding, about everything else. About the house and the porch and the way the rain sounds on the roof in October. About the work I do and the places she'd been and the small ordinary facts of two lives that had been running parallel in the same house and had finally turned toward each other. I didn't touch her that night, and I didn't try. But when I finally stood up to leave, she said goodnight in a voice that held the same warmth as the perfume in the hallway. And I said it back. And the word good meant something it hadn't meant before. The morning after that conversation on the porch, I woke up before the sun and lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and felt the house differently than I'd ever felt it. It wasn't mine alone anymore, and the realization wasn't sad or frightening. It was just true, the way a level is true when the bubble sits dead center and you know the surface is flat. I went downstairs and made coffee, and for the first time in 6 months, I made enough for two. I set a mug on the counter, not as a gesture, but as a fact, the way you set out an extra plate when you know someone's coming to the table. When she came down, she saw it and didn't say anything, and she poured herself a cup and sat at the table, and we drank our coffee in the morning light without needing to fill the silence. But the hallway conversation was still between us. Unfinished. The words she'd said in that narrow space, the way she'd smiled, the truth she'd named about what she needed and who she needed it from, all of it was sitting on the counter, like that plate of pasta she'd brought me weeks ago. I'd taken it to my room and eaten it alone. I wasn't going to do that again. That evening, I came home from work and she was in the kitchen, and I didn't go to my room. I set my things down and stood at the counter across from her, and I said her name, and she turned around and looked at me and waited. I told her what I should have told her in the hallway that night. I told her I'd noticed her perfume the first time she wore it, not just the night I said something about it. I told her I'd noticed every time she left her door cracked, and every time she asked me to fix something that didn't need fixing, and every time she stood close enough that I could feel the warmth of her and pretended I didn't. I told her I hadn't trusted it. The years between us and the lease between us and the way my life had been quiet so long, I'd started thinking quiet was all it was ever going to be. I told her I'd been wrong about that, and the biggest wrong was thinking that distance was the same as safety. She listened without interrupting and without looking away, and when I finished, she didn't cry or fill the silence with reassurances. She just stood there in the kitchen, with the overhead light making her hair glow, and she stepped closer, not hallway close, but closer, and she said the thing that undid every careful wall I'd built in 10 years of living alone. I wasn't standing that close by accident. The weight of it landed in my chest and settled there like something I'd been carrying for months without knowing what it was. She'd chosen the hallway and the perfume, and every moment I thought was chance. Every shoulder brush, and every open door, and every plate of food left on the counter for a man too scared to stay in the room and eat it where it was given. I reached for her hand. Not her face, not her waist, not anything that would have been too much or too fast or too different from the man she'd chosen because he was steady. Her hand. The simplest thing I could offer, the most honest, the thing my father would have understood because it's what you reach for when you don't have words and you need to show someone you're not going anywhere. She took it. Her fingers closed around mine and her thumb rested on my knuckles, and we stood there in the kitchen, under the overhead light, holding hands like two people who'd been standing at the edge of something for a long time and had finally stopped pretending the edge wasn't there. I fixed a lot of things in my life, broken pipes and bad wiring and crooked doors and rotted porches. This wasn't something I could fix. This was something I had to stop breaking, and the breaking had been the distance I kept putting between us, and the fixing was just this, standing still and holding on and not walking away. We stood there for a long time with the refrigerator humming and the kitchen window dark, and somewhere outside the crickets were going, and the house was quiet, and the quiet wasn't empty anymore. Not even close. I fixed the bathroom door that afternoon. The one that had been sticking for months because I'd kept putting off a problem that was easy to live with. When I closed it this time, it latched clean and didn't stick at all, and she was standing in the hallway watching me do it. And when I turned and looked at her, she didn't step aside, and I didn't want her to. If you like this one, there are more stories on the porch. Pull up a chair,